Decided to do things a little bit differently this time. My little brother's been very kind and has let me borrow his audio equipment, so I'm doing a voiceover this time. Currently what you can see is the pattern I used for the inner lining of the mane and the base material that I sewed the mane wefts onto. It consisted of the main hood pattern and triangles to fit over the shoulder. Just gives you some allowance so your shoulders can fit into there. One important thing to note is notching the top corners on the main base rather than the triangles. If you do that, it creates that little square there, and it will keep your pattern laying flat when it's actually on the mannequin as well, and when it's been worn. It's just a small dressmaking technique that comes in really handy. It also lets you stretch out your fabric fully so it's nice and straight when you're sewing it, so overall it's just easier to sew. You should be sewing your darts last if you have any. You want to also make sure that if you have any zips in your lining, that you sew the zip in before you sew the last dart. That's me just there stretching it out. It's a little awkward trying to hold the camera and point it out at the same time. So, as you can see, that's the pattern I used. For the main base of the wefts, I only used that pattern that you can see on the screen there. The triangle, I sewed in a triangle of fur instead of making the mane on that as well. As you can see, I do also have a curved dart on there. It's easier to do straight darts, but a curved dart will give you a nice smoother line. As you can see, that's the sewn up version of the shoulder triangle. So it sits fairly flat when you lay it on the table like that. This one was the lining piece for it. So the seams that you're seeing are encased into the mask between the weft layer and the lining layer, so you don't see the seams at all on it, which is quite nice. You can do is press your seams. That will make them less bulky, but it's not necessary to do that. You do want to, however, is clip your seams. If you clip small notches across any of the curves, it won't bunch up when it stretches or anything like that, so that's quite nice to do. Normally if you're doing a zip, you would sew it the majority of the length of the hood rather than just a small portion. This is just me showing the seam allowances that I used for it. I used a 5mm seam allowance. You don't necessarily need a major seam allowance for it. A 5mm to 10mm seam is fine. It's not as if we're doing French seams or anything like that, so we don't need to put any major allowance on there for that. I do have a red mark on my sewing machine footer that you can't really see there, but it's just in between the small hole that you can see my pen pointing to, or my pencil. So that's the back seam sewn. I did not do a zipper in this one, purely because of all the main fibres. I didn't want to chance them getting caught in it. And there's enough stretch in the material for it to be virtually useless to put a zip in there. If you are going to do a zip, however, you would press your seam here and then you would sew your zip onto it, and then you would cut the seam. Use a seam ripper and just pop the stitches, and that would give you a nicely enclosed zip. You can do a hidden zipper that way, but I wouldn't recommend a hidden zipper on a fursuit head. The teeth are just really small and the chance of getting your fur and things like that caught up in the zip are a lot higher. As you can see, I have not done the dart yet. That will be the one next on the list. So one side of it's curved, the other side's virtually straight. But it will curve round and it'll sit on your head nicely. There we are, that's it sewn now. That's it also notched, and I've trimmed the corner on it so it's less bulky. As it's a stretch fabric, you can use a zigzag stitch as well. The zigzag stitch would probably be a better alternative, however the straight stitch does work just fine. At that point, the area I'm pointing to was where you would sew your zipper to. It wouldn't be throughout the whole length of it, but it would be the majority of it. I will need to clip those seams as well. As you can see, that's the original hood that I had for it. I decided to change it because I wanted the back liner to have a pointed end to it. This is me now sewing up the area which I am going to put the wefts onto. As you can see, there's an area that I did cut out. I did make an extra allowance for extra fur on the shoulder seams. It's the same pattern, it's just I changed up what was fur and what was wefts. As you can see there, how if you were to sew up the weft, not the weft, the dart first, you can see how that would bunch up there. It does get slightly awkward if you do try and sew it. I believe I did sew this one up on this one. You can see here all the custom blends that I did. I got these wefts from, I believe it was Cyberlocks. It's a UK weft company. They sell pretty much just jumbo braid and different things for dreadlocks and things like that. What I did when starting the weft was I did put 2 lines of masking tape, sticky side up. I tacked the edge down, and then I started putting small bits of the wefts and spreading it up along the sticky side. You don't make it majorly thick, but you don't want it like 5 hairs per centimetre or something like that. If you do them thicker, your wefts will turn out thicker as well. Because what we're going to do is we're going to eventually fold this over and sew it down. Here you can see I've stuck more tape on. I did put this bit at the bottom as well. This one just helps the tracks from staying parallel. If you don't have that, your tracks can slide around a lot and it gets really awkward, especially when you come to sewing it. You will need to machine sew these. You can hand sew, but I don't recommend it. It's probably not going to last any length of time. But this is all preparation for the wefts for the machine. So we at the machine now. What we are going to do is we are going to sew 4 lines onto this weft. If you have a double needle or a triple needle, this will go much faster, and you'll only need to do it once or twice. For this one, I position the footer on one side of the masking tape. This is just so the footer has something to grip when it's going through the machine. because the hair is very slidey, and as you can see later in the video, it gets caught up very easy. So press your footer down, grab your tails of thread, make sure you have them firm because your machine can sometimes eat them up too. You want to back stitch when you start. As I say, if I had a double needle, I could just do 2 passes of this and then it would be done on to the next stage. But as it was, I was working with a single needle. I've misplaced my double needle somewhere. So just make sure your tension's standard and you want to use the smallest stitch that you can as well. On my machine it's a 6 and my tension was set to 4. You do want to back stitch when you start as well. Usually you want to back stitch on anything you start on, unless you're doing basting stitches. So let's start sewing now. If you keep the tape under one side of the footer, just depends what you're comfortable with. I did pull this through. As you can see, the hair is virtually not visible when you're sewing it, but you can see it on the sides. Back stitch when you get to the end and put your needle down, and then you need to turn your project in the machine. Make sure you're still close to or on the masking tape this time as well. Because there's already a line of stitch in there, it will hold it in place a lot better than before. So you don't necessarily need to be on the masking tape this time, but it is helpful. So that's the second pass. And once you get to the end, back stitch again. Pull your needle down and lift your footer and turn your project round again. So the third pass this time. This is going on in real time as well, so the overall main had about 65 wefts in it. All of them were handmade, so it took a very long time to sew. I think it took me about 6 days in total just for the main alone, because I had to custom mix all the fibres as well. But I liked how the result turned out. The overall shape of the main was quite wide, quite fabulous. Back stitch again. Pull your needle down, turn your project round, and this is the last time you're going to go through on this side. There is another set of sewing that you do need to do. However, you will need to press the weft before then. So once the first line of stitching's through, you don't really need to pull it through anymore. It's just a case of guiding it through. So your weft stitching area will likely be wider than a commercial stitch. As you can see, that's the 4 layers done there. The end of my video cut off a wee bit because my camera died at that point. But we're at the ironing board now, and what I do is snip the ends. You need to take off the masking tape completely now. If you leave it on while you're ironing, it won't like you. You can leave it on if you manage to sew your weft in a way that you have enough room for your iron to press the weft but not melt the glue that's on the masking tape. So for about half of them I did take the masking tape off whilst pressing it, and then for another half, once I had enough room allowance on, I pressed it with the masking tape on. But you don't want your iron touching the masking tape. If you do that, you'll be left with this gungy, horrible stuff, and it will stick to the wefts and you'll never get it out. You will lose some hair in this process as well, even if you do it after you've sewn the last track. As you can see there, you see some of the fibres that you're losing. You will lose fibres across the whole making of this. There's no way to avoid doing that. This is also a different weft I was doing as well. There is probably a way to do this where you lose less fibres, however this is just the method that I've come to use. It is easier for pressing if you do have the tape on, but if you've sewn too close, as I said, in this one I'd sewn too close so I had to remove it. And you should be able to see my painstaking ironing process in a moment. I grabbed the tails for this one. It does help if you brush out the weft fibres as well. You will lose some fibres in brushing as well. That is unavoidable. But what we're going to do is we're going to fold this weft in half along the stitch line. As you can see, it doesn't want to do it, so that's why you press it. I use my ruler as a guide here to keep it in place whilst I'm trying to keep it all down. Depending on what the fibres you're using, your heat settings will be slightly different. This was on low and I was using a heat setting Kiln. So the fibres that I was using were designed to be used for heat as well, or styled with heat. But if you do it too much, you'll end up melting the fibres. So you don't want to melt the fibres, you just want to press them down so that they retain the shape. And there you can see that's that done. What you will need to do now is sew over the top of the stitches you've already done another 4 times. That will lock the whole weft in place. It might be a bit of overkill, however I am a firm believer in that sewing is better over gluing. I know you can glue your wefts in, so there's nothing wrong with that. I might just prefer to sew it. So you can see, you'll be able to see in a moment how easy it is for your machine to eat the wefts as well. It should be this one, but this is the first pass on the locking layer. That's you locking in your tracts and making sure it doesn't come out. Sometimes your weft will want to try and go back to the original flat shape as well, which is why the pressing helps too. You just take this slowly, but you're sewing directly above the tracts that you just made on the first pass, or the first 4 passes. When you get to the end, you back stitch as well. And I believe it's this one that it tries to eat it on. Oh yeah, my camera was on a tripod and it kept hitting off the table, so I was just adjusting that there. Yeah, it's this one. So one advantage of having your tails is so that what happens next doesn't happen. So I just go to start it and it will eat it up in a second. So that is unfortunately something that does happen. If you don't have enough past the footer, it will just suck it down into the machine. I managed to save this one. Sometimes you can't save them, sometimes you'll have to trim them shorter. But this is a case of, you can see a wee bit how some of the fibres were forced out of their place. That's me just pulling them back into place now. That's why the locking layer that you're doing over the top helps a lot when keeping the fibres in place. And I've just pulled the threads out so I've got a nice tail to hold on to. And there you can see the issue of it eating it up is no longer apparent. So this is the second one. There's another 2 more passes to be done on this one. Another thing you can do is use sometimes nail glue. You do get a specific glue for keeping fray check, that's it. You can cover the weft stitches in fray check as well, and that should help keep things in place as well if you want to be extra secure. And nail glue is another alternative to that one. This is the third pass. As you get more lines of stitching in, it turns out the whole process gets easier and easier. You also don't necessarily need to make your own wefts as well. The process after this one of attaching the wefts, if you buy wefts, you'll be able to just go straight to that one. And this is only just because I was doing a custom blend. I wanted very peculiar shades of tan and silver and blonde all mixed together for this. You can also control the volume a lot easier if you make your own wefts as well, as opposed to factory bought wefts who normally you can only get them straight. But this also helps if you do have factory wefts and you cut them down and you've got extra fibres left over and you need to make other wefts for your project as well. Same sort of method you would use. That's me cutting it off the end there. At that point you would trim the edges, and you can use fray check. I just decided not to because I've got so much stitching going on. I then stitch these to the base as well. I made in the second segment. After you finish sewing it, do a final inspection and see if any areas need to go over again. At this point you might want to brush your wefts again as well. It just helps keep them all organised. So now we're attaching. I've just decided to time-lapse this. As you can see, there's the layer of fur. I've got one layer of weft on. When you're attaching a weft down, you want to make sure it overlaps the end of the previous weft. This will just make sure there's no gaps or anything like that. For this, I just used the same straight stitch that I used on while sewing the base liner together. it goes relatively fast once you've got your wefts all together. If you're using factory wefts at this point, you would just start sewing it to that. You can sew to the fur as well. I've done that before, and that does help add a bit of volume as well. As you can see, I do go a wee bit slow with this. Double check your fibres and placements. You want to backstitch as well occasionally. You can hand sew them on at this point as well. But you can see just how much volume is created as well. I'll have a photo at the end of the video where I have the final main produced as well. There's the occasional backstitch. As you get more wefts on as well, you might find it a little more difficult to manipulate because one side will be huge and poofy, as you can see. But as long as you keep brushing it back, it should be fine. This is where it is easier to hand stitch it on whilst it's on your mannequin so it lies in the correct order. But yeah, as you can see, there's a lot more left to do on that. It's another time lapse of it. For this one I just decided to turn the camera on and just try and sew as much as I could. The main wefts were assembled in 1.5 days, I believe. But as you get more of them on, it gets easier. I did decide that I was going to not sew up the back panel, just so that made sewing the wefts on a lot easier. You might be able to see later in this, because there's curves on it, you have to do some areas of wefts tighter than the others and have some that are looser so that your curves can be compensated as well. As you can see there. Before I get to the end of the weft, I put on another weft so they're both overlapping together. Backstitch over the top of them when it meets the join, and then just keep stitching. As you can see there, that's don't know if you can see it properly, but there is a curve there as well. I've brought the area which I sew up, there's about a 5mm gap in underneath the weft there, from where I'm sewing between that and the other one on the curved area. That is just so I can get that area filled out. If you were doing a wig as well, the same sort of stuff would apply. You probably want to do your tracks about between 5mm apart. In some areas you will go tighter than that, and some areas you will go looser than that. It just depends on the whole how you want it to lie kind of thing. And that's me stitching over the corner of the triangle on the part of the fur. This is just to make it all round and nice. So if you do have any questions about this or want to know anything extra that I haven't covered in this, feel free to comment as well. Instead of cutting the wefts as well, you can loop them over and pull them back on themselves. I'd say there was only a small bit over there, so for this one I decided to look back on it. So I'll sew to the end and then tack stitch it down. I did leave about 5mm on the end on one side of the presser foot. This was just so sewing up later on made it easier. But you'll need to lift your keep your presser foot down and then curve your weft round. Lift your presser foot and your needle up and then pull it all round underneath it. So at this point I just joined it straight exactly onto the top of the previous weft. Run out of bobbin thread as well. You are going to go through a lot of bobbin thread on this. It helps to have some all nicely wound up before. If not, you're going to spend a lot of your time rewinding bobbins. You will need a lot of thread for this as well. I was using the large spools that are for overlockers for this. Keep in mind and trim all your excess threads on the end as well. And you see that's just, I think that was just 4 tracks there. It was either 3 or 4. But this is all on the inside, so you won't see that. The liner on the inside will stop you from seeing that. And here are some photos of the finished wefted way. As you can see, it's a lot of volume on it. You don't necessarily need to have that much volume, but this is just the process that I used in making this. So yeah, if you have any questions at all, just leave a comment with whatever you want to know. And thank you for watching.